The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of Clarence's house as King Charles III sat in his private study, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out at the gray London sky. The weight of the crown had settled upon his shoulders only months earlier, but already the pressures of kingship were testing relationships he had thought unshakable. Among them, the most delicate and complex was his relationship with his wife Camilla's family, the Parkers and Bowles clan, who had once welcomed him with open arms but now found themselves facing an unexpected chill from the man they had known for decades. The transformation had been gradual at first, barely noticeable to those outside the inner circle. But within the palace walls, staff members whispered about the king's sudden formality toward people who had once shared his dinner table as friends. Lady Sarah McCorquodale, Diana's sister, had noticed it first during a small gathering at Highgrove House just weeks after the coronation. Charles had greeted Camilla's son Tom Parker Bowles with a mere nod, addressing him as Mr. Parker Bowles instead of the familiar Tom that had been his custom for years. The seeds of this dramatic shift could be traced back to a conversation that had taken place behind closed doors at Windsor Castle. Sir Clive Alderton, Charles's private secretary, had presented the new king with a comprehensive briefing about the changing dynamics of public perception regarding the royal family. The document, marked strictly confidential, outlined the delicate balance the monarchy needed to maintain between personal relationships and public duty. It was a balance that would prove more challenging than Charles had ever imagined. Camilla's family had been part of Charles's life for over 5 decades, woven into the fabric of his personal history in ways that were both beautiful and complicated. Tom Parker Bowles, now a successful food critic and author, had known Charles since he was a young boy. Laura Lopez, Camilla's daughter, had her own children who called Charles Grandpa, and had grown up visiting royal residences as naturally as visiting their grandmother's cottage. The extended family, cousins, in-laws, and longtime friends of the Parker Bowles and Shand families had formed a warm, inclusive network that had provided Charles with something the rigid protocol of royal life often denied him: genuine, unconditional relationships. The irony was not lost on those who knew the family well. For years, Charles had fought to have Camilla accepted by the establishment and the public. He had weathered storms of criticism, endured years of separation, and carefully orchestrated a gradual rehabilitation of their relationship in the eyes of the nation. The journey from the dark days following Diana's death to Camilla's eventual acceptance as queen consort had been long and arduous. Now, just as that acceptance had been achieved, Charles was pulling away from the very people who had supported them through their most difficult times. The first major incident that palace insiders would later point to as the beginning of the rift occurred during a family dinner at Sandringham in late September. The gathering was meant to be a celebration of Camilla's birthday, a private affair with her children, grandchildren, and a few close family friends. Charles had been warm and attentive to Camilla throughout the evening, but his interactions with her relatives had been markedly different from previous such gatherings. When Tom Parker Bowles attempted to engage the king in their usual banter about food and restaurants, Charles had responded with polite but distant pleasantries. The easy camaraderie that had characterized their relationship for decades seemed to have evaporated overnight. Laura Lopez, typically one of Charles's favorites among Camilla's children, found herself receiving the same formal treatment. The atmosphere around the dinner table grew increasingly tense as family members struggled to understand what had changed. Behind the scenes, palace staff were equally puzzled by the king's new demeanor. Angela Kelly, who had served the royal household for decades, confided to a colleague that she had never seen Charles so deliberately formal with people he clearly cared about. The change was so pronounced that even the household staff began adjusting their own behavior, unsure of how to navigate the new dynamics. The pressure was particularly intense for Camilla herself, who found herself caught between her loyalty to her husband and her love for her family. She had worked tirelessly over the years to help her children and grandchildren understand the unique demands of royal life, preparing them for the increased scrutiny and protocol that would come with her marriage to Charles. Never had she imagined that the greatest challenge would come from within, from Charles himself creating distance where there had once been warmth. The situation became even more complex when considering the broader context of Charles's reign. He had ascended to the throne with clear ideas about modernizing the monarchy, streamlining operations, and creating a more efficient, cost-effective institution. The concept of a slimmed-down monarchy had been one of his key talking points for years. However, the The practical implementation of these ideas was proving more emotionally challenging than anyone had anticipated. Palace advisors had begun to suggest that Charles needed to be more careful about the appearance of favoritism toward his wife's family. There were concerns about public perception, particularly given the ongoing conversations about the cost of the monarchy and its relevance in modern Britain. The advisors argued that too much visibility for Camilla's extended family could be seen as the royals expanding their circle of privilege at taxpayers' expense. These bureaucratic concerns, however, failed to account for the deeply personal nature of Charles's relationships with these individuals. Tom Parker Bowles had been a constant presence in Charles's life since the 1970s, sharing his passion for organic farming, traditional crafts, and environmental conservation. Their relationship had evolved from the formal connection of a potential stepfather to genuine friendship built on shared interests and mutual respect. Similarly, Laura Lopez had developed her own unique relationship with Charles, one that had flourished particularly after she became a mother. Charles had shown genuine delight in his role as step-grandfather to her children, often spending hours with them in the gardens at Highgrove, teaching them about plants and wildlife with the same enthusiasm he had once shown his own sons. The warmth and naturalness of these relationships had been one of the few areas where Charles could simply be himself, away from the constraints of royal duty. The emotional toll of maintaining this new formal distance was evident to those closest to the king. His longtime valet reported that Charles seemed more isolated than usual, spending longer hours in his study and taking more solitary walks around the grounds of his various residences. The natural ease that had characterized his interactions with Camilla's family had been replaced by a careful, measured approach that seemed to drain him of energy. Meanwhile, the extended Parker Bowles and Shand families were struggling to understand the new reality. Annabelle Elliott, Camilla's sister who had worked as an interior designer on several royal properties, found herself receiving much more formal communications about projects that had previously been discussed over casual family dinners. The personal touch that had made working with the royal household a family affair was disappearing, replaced by proper channels and official protocols. The transformation was particularly difficult for the younger generation of Camilla's family. Her grandchildren, who had grown accustomed to informal visits and warm interactions with Grandpa Charles, were now being prepared by their parents for much more formal encounters. Birthday parties and family celebrations that had once been relaxed affairs were now subject to careful planning and protocol considerations. The media, ever watchful for signs of drama within the royal family, had begun to notice the subtle changes. Royal correspondents who had grown accustomed to seeing Camilla's family members at various events and gatherings noted their decreased visibility. Speculation began to build about potential rifts or disagreements, though the true nature of the situation remained hidden behind the palace's carefully maintained facade of unity and discretion. For Charles himself, the internal conflict was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. On one hand, he understood intellectually the arguments his advisors were making about the need for clear boundaries and proper protocol. The monarchy he had inherited was facing unprecedented challenges, and every decision was scrutinized for its implications about the institution's future. On the other hand, the emotional cost of distancing himself from people who had been genuine sources of support and companionship was higher than he had anticipated. The situation was further complicated by Camilla's own position as queen consort. She had spent years learning to navigate the complex expectations of royal life, understanding when to step forward and when to step back, when to speak and when to remain silent. The current situation required a level of diplomatic skill that tested even her considerable experience. She needed to support her husband's decisions while also maintaining her relationships with her own family, all while ensuring that her position as queen consort remained uncompromised. As autumn turned toward winter, the palace staff began to observe subtle changes in the daily rhythms of royal life. Invitations to informal gatherings became less frequent. Family dinners were replaced by more formal occasions with carefully planned guest lists and structured agendas. The spontaneous visits and casual conversations that had once been a hallmark of Charles's relationship with Camilla's family were becoming increasingly rare. The ripple effects of these changes extended beyond immediate family members to the broader network of friends and associates who had been part of Charles and Camilla's social circle for decades. Long-standing friendships were being reevaluated through the lens of royal protocol and public perception. Relationships that had been built on genuine affection and shared experiences were now being measured against their potential impact on the monarchy's reputation and efficiency. The king's cold silence toward Camilla's family was not just a personal matter. It was a symptom of the broader challenges facing a modern monarchy, trying to balance tradition with contemporary expectations, personal relationships with public duty, and emotional authenticity with institutional requirements. As the winter months approached, it became clear that this was only the beginning of a much larger transformation that would test the very foundations of how the royal family understood itself and its place in British society. The palace corridors, once filled with the warmth of extended family gatherings and informal conversations, now echoed with a more formal atmosphere. Staff members adjusted their expectations and behaviors, understanding that a new era had begun, one where the lines between personal and public, family and institution would be more clearly and coldly drawn than ever before. The December frost had settled over Windsor Castle when the most significant confrontation between Charles and Camilla's family finally erupted into the open. It began with what should have been a simple matter, the annual Christmas arrangements at Sandringham. For years, the Parker Bowles and Shand families had been integral parts of the royal Christmas celebrations, with Tom, Laura, and their children joining the traditional festivities alongside other members of the royal family. This year, however, the invitations that usually arrived in late October had not materialized. Camilla had waited as long as she could before approaching Charles about the oversight. The conversation took place in the blue drawing room at Buckingham Palace on a gray December afternoon, with the sounds of London traffic filtering through the heavy curtains. When Camilla finally asked about the Christmas plans for her family, Charles's response was measured but devastating in its implications. The king explained that Sir Clive Alderton and the other senior advisors had recommended a more focused approach to the Christmas celebrations. The guest list needed to reflect the new priorities of the streamlined monarchy, and there were concerns about the optics of extending royal hospitality to what some courtiers privately referred to as peripheral family members. The words hung in the air between them, each syllable carrying the weight of a fundamental shift in how Charles viewed his relationship with the people who had welcomed him into their family decades earlier. Camilla's reaction was swift and uncharacteristic. Those who knew the queen consort understood her to be a woman of remarkable composure, someone who had learned through years of public scrutiny to maintain her equilibrium even under the most challenging circumstances. But the exclusion of her family from Christmas struck at something deeper than protocol or public perception. It challenged the very foundation of what she had believed their marriage represented. The argument that followed was conducted in the controlled tones that royal training had ingrained in both of them. But the intensity was unmistakable. Palace staff working in adjacent rooms later reported hearing raised voices, though the specific words remained private. What was clear to everyone within the household was that the queen consort had drawn a line in a way that few had ever witnessed. Tom Parker Bowles learned of his exclusion from the Christmas celebrations through his mother rather than directly from Charles, a breach of the personal relationship they had maintained for so many years that it felt like a deliberation insult. The conversation between mother and son took place at Camilla's private apartment in Clarence House, where she struggled to explain a situation that she herself was still trying to understand. Tom's response revealed the depth of hurt that Charles's new formality had caused throughout Camilla's family. For decades, he had navigated the complex terrain of being the stepson of the heir to the throne, managing his own career and public profile while respecting the boundaries and expectations that came with his mother's position. He had endured years of media scrutiny, public speculation about his relationship with Charles, and the constant balancing act of being both a private individual and a public figure by association. The exclusion from Christmas felt like a negation of all those years of careful navigation and genuine relationship building. Tom had come to regard Charles not just as his stepfather but as someone who had shown genuine interest in his career, his children, and his life. The food critic had often credited Charles with encouraging his interest in sustainable farming and organic food production, conversations that had evolved from polite stepfather-stepson exchanges into passionate discussions between two people who shared deep convictions about environmental responsibility and traditional craftsmanship. Laura Lopez received the news of her Christmas exclusion with a different kind of shock. As an artist and gallery owner, she had always maintained a more private profile than her brother, but her relationship with Charles had been particularly warm and natural. Her children's relationship with their step-grandfather had been one of the few areas where royal protocol seemed to dissolve entirely, replaced by genuine affection and shared interests. The practical implications of the Christmas exclusion extended beyond hurt feelings to logistical complications that revealed how deeply integrated Camilla's family had become into the royal household's operations. For years, Laura's children had participated in the traditional Christmas morning gift exchange at Sandringham. Their stockings hung alongside those of Prince William's children and other young royals. The household staff had grown accustomed to accommodating their dietary preferences, organizing activities suited to their ages, and ensuring that their visit contributed to the warm family atmosphere that Charles himself had always cherished. The removal of these familiar faces from the Christmas landscape represented more than just a guest list change. It was a fundamental alteration of the family dynamic that Charles had worked for decades to create. The king had often spoken about his desire for a more inclusive, warm family environment, drawing on his own sometimes difficult experiences with royal formality as a child. The irony of his current position was not lost on those who had observed his journey from lonely heir to paterfamilias. Behind the scenes at Buckingham Palace, the Christmas controversy had created divisions among the staff that reflected broader tensions about the direction of Charles's reign. Veteran courtiers who had served the late Queen Elizabeth II found themselves torn between loyalty to established protocols and recognition that Charles's relationship with Camilla's family had always been somewhat outside traditional royal boundaries. Sir Clive Alderton, as the king's private secretary, found himself in the particularly difficult position of defending policies that he had helped create, but that were now causing obvious distress within the royal family. The streamlining of the monarchy had been presented as a necessary modernization, a way of making the institution more relevant and cost-effective for contemporary Britain. However, the human cost of these changes was proving more significant than the policy papers had anticipated. The Christmas controversy also highlighted the unique challenges facing Camilla as queen consort. Unlike previous queens consort who had typically come from aristocratic families with their own understanding of royal protocol, Camilla had brought a different kind of family dynamic to the royal household. Her children were successful professionals with their own careers and public profiles. Her grandchildren were being raised in a more relaxed, contemporary style, and her extended family represented a blend of traditional British upper-middle-class values with modern sensibilities. This difference had initially been seen as refreshing and beneficial to the monarchy's public image. Camilla's family brought a touch of normalcy and relatability that contrasted positively with the sometimes austere formality of traditional royal life. Tom's career as a food critic and author made him an accessible figure for media interviews, while Laura's work in the art world connected the royals to contemporary cultural conversations. Their children's more natural, less formal behavior at public events had been charmed by media and public alike. Now, however, these same qualities were being viewed through a different lens by Charles's advisors. The informality that had once been seen as an asset was now being framed as a potential liability in an era when the monarchy needed to demonstrate discipline, efficiency, and clear boundaries. The cost of maintaining relationships with Camilla's extended family, in terms of security, accommodation, and public perception, was being weighed against the benefits with a new mathematical coldness that prioritized institutional concerns over personal relationships. The ripple effects of the Christmas exclusions extended far beyond Sandringham House itself. Annual Boxing Day shoots that had traditionally included Tom Parker bowls were quietly reorganized without his participation. New Year celebrations that had become family traditions were restructured to focus on core royal family members. Even smaller, more intimate gatherings throughout the year began to reflect the new boundaries that Charles was establishing. For Camilla herself, the situation represented the most serious challenge to her marriage since the early days of public controversy following Diana's death. She had spent years learning to balance her role as wife, mother, and royal figure, but the current circumstances required a different kind of navigation entirely. Her loyalty to Charles as both husband and king was unquestionable, but her obligations to her own children and grandchildren were equally strong. The queen consort began to implement her own quiet campaign to maintain family relationships while respecting the new boundaries that Charles was establishing. Private dinners at Clarence House became more frequent, providing opportunities for family members to gather away from the formal structures of official royal residences. Birthday celebrations and other family milestones were arranged with careful attention to timing and location, ensuring that they did not conflict with or challenge the new protocols while still maintaining family bonds. These private arrangements, however, could not address the deeper emotional wounds that were developing within Camilla's family. The exclusion from traditional royal gatherings felt like a rejection not just of their presence, but of their years of support and discretion. Tom and Laura had both endured decades of media attention and public scrutiny related to their mother's relationship with Charles, always maintaining dignity and loyalty even when the coverage was intrusive or unflattering. The sense of betrayal was particularly acute because of how gradually Charles had become integrated into their family structure. Unlike other royal marriages where boundaries had been clear from the beginning, Charles and Camilla's long relationship had evolved organically, with family bonds developing naturally over time. Tom's children had grown up knowing Charles as a grandfather figure. Laura had sought his advice on various personal and professional matters, and the extended family had created traditions and shared memories that transcended formal protocols. The winter months following the Christmas exclusions saw a noticeable change in the atmosphere surrounding official royal events. Media observers noted that Camilla's family members were no longer visible at their usual variety of royal occasions, from charity galas to informal public appearances. The absence was subtle but consistent, creating speculation among royal correspondents about potential changes in palace policy or family relationships. Within the palace itself, staff members struggled to adapt to the new dynamics. Household arrangements that had become routine over years of accommodation for Camilla's family needed to be adjusted or eliminated entirely. Security protocols that had been developed to include regular visits from Tom, Laura, and their children were scaled back. Even gift-giving protocols for birthdays and Christmas required revision to reflect the new boundaries. The emotional toll on Charles himself became increasingly evident to those closest to him. Despite the formal distance he was maintaining from Camilla's family, he continued to ask about their welfare and activities, suggesting that his feelings toward them remained unchanged even as his behavior had shifted dramatically. The king appeared to be struggling with the contradiction between his personal affections and his institutional obligations, a conflict that was affecting his mood and energy levels in ways that concerned his closest advisors and medical staff. The new year brought with it a crisis that would test the foundations of Charles's relationship with Camilla's family in ways that no one had anticipated. It began with a routine visit to Highgrove House in late January, where Charles had retreated for one of his regular periods of private reflection away from the formal constraints of London. The king often found solace in his beloved gardens during difficult periods, and the recent tensions with Camilla's family had made these retreats more necessary than ever. On this particular weekend, Laura Lopez's youngest daughter, Eliza, suffered a serious accident while riding her bicycle near the family's countryside home in Wiltshire. The 8-year-old was rushed to the local hospital with a suspected concussion and broken arm, the kind of childhood emergency that brings families together regardless of any ongoing tensions or disagreements. Laura's frantic phone call to her mother came just as Camilla was preparing to join Charles for their planned quiet weekend at Highgrove. The queen consort's immediate response was instinctive and maternal. She needed to be with her daughter and granddaughter during this frightening time. However, the protocol implications of her departure created an immediate dilemma. Charles had planned important meetings with his environmental advisors for the weekend, sessions that had been scheduled around Camilla's presence and participation. More significantly, this emergency represented the first major test of the new boundaries that Charles had established regarding Camilla's family. When Camilla informed Charles of the situation and her intention to go to the hospital, his initial response reflected the formal distance he had been maintaining. Rather than immediately offering support or suggesting they go together, as would have been his natural response in years past, Charles hesitated. The pause was brief, but telling, a moment that crystallized for Camilla just how much their family dynamics had shifted. She realized that her husband was calculating the protocol implications of their response to her granddaughter's accident rather than simply responding as a concerned grandfather figure. The conversation that followed in the garden room at Highgrove became a turning point in their marriage. Camilla, despite years of training in royal protocol and diplomatic restraint, found herself unable to maintain the careful balance she had been struggling to preserve. The potential seriousness of Eliza's injuries, combined with months of accumulated frustration over Charles's treatment of her family, created a perfect storm of emotional release. For the first time in their marriage, Camilla explicitly challenged the advice Charles was receiving from his courtiers about family relationships. She pointed out that Eliza had called Charles grandpa since she could speak, that she had spent countless hours in his gardens learning about plants and wildlife, and that his absence during this crisis would send a message to a vulnerable child that protocol mattered more than family love. The argument was passionate, but controlled, each point delivered with the precision of someone who had been thinking carefully about these issues for months. Charles's response revealed the depth of his own internal conflict. He wanted to support Camilla and be present for Eliza, but he had been persuaded by his advisors that every action was being scrutinized for its implications about the monarchy's future direction. The idea of rushing to the hospital bedside of his step-granddaughter could be interpreted as favoritism toward Camilla's family, potentially setting a precedent that would be difficult to maintain consistently across all family relationships. The practical resolution of the immediate crisis reflected the compromise that both Charles and Camilla would be forced to accept in their new reality. Camilla went to the hospital alone, arriving to find Tom Parker Bowles already there with Laura and her husband. The absence of Charles was noted by hospital staff and, inevitably, by the media when news of the accident became public several days later. Eliza's recovery progressed well, with her concussion proving minor and her arm healing cleanly. However, the 8-year-old's repeated questions about why Grandpa Charles hadn't come to see her in the hospital created a family crisis that extended far beyond the medical emergency. Laura found herself in the impossible position of trying to explain to her daughter why someone she considered a loving grandfather had suddenly become unavailable during one of the scariest experiences of her young life. The incident forced Tom Parker Bowles to confront directly the changed nature of his relationship with Charles. As Eliza's uncle and someone she adored, Tom felt a responsibility to address the confusion and hurt she was experiencing. His decision to request a private meeting with the king represented the first direct challenge to the new protocol from within Camilla's family. The meeting took place at Clarence House on a gray February morning, conducted in Charles's private study with its familiar atmosphere of intellectual pursuit and environmental consciousness. The room, lined with books on organic farming, architectural preservation, and spiritual philosophy, had been the setting for countless informal conversations between the two men over the years. Now it felt formal and strange, as if the personal history contained within its walls had been deliberately archived. Tom's approach to the conversation reflected his understanding of both Charles's personality and the complex pressures of royal life. Rather than focusing on his own hurt feelings or the broader family dynamics, he concentrated specifically on the impact Charles's absence was having on his niece. He described Eliza's confusion about why her grandfather had suddenly become unavailable, her questions about whether she had done something wrong, and her growing anxiety about family relationships she had always taken for granted. The conversation revealed Charles's genuine anguish over the situation he had created. The king's love for Camilla's grandchildren had always been authentic and deep, one of the few areas of his life where royal protocol had never intruded on natural affection. His environmental passion had found eager students in the children, who had learned to identify plants, understand sustainable farming principles, and appreciate the intricate relationships within natural ecosystems through their time with him at Highgrove and other royal residences. Charles's response to Tom's concerns was revealing in what it said about the pressure he was feeling from his advisors and the broader establishment. He acknowledged that the situation was painful for everyone involved, but he also articulated fears about setting precedents that could be used against the monarchy by its critics. Every gesture of favoritism toward Camilla's family, he had been told, could be weaponized by those who argued that the royal family was expanding its circle of privilege at public expense. The meeting concluded without resolution, but with a clearer understanding of the forces at work. Tom left Clarence House with the realization that Charles was not acting purely from personal choice, but was responding to institutional pressures that were stronger than his personal preferences. However, this understanding did little to address the practical impact on family relationships or the emotional needs of the children caught in the middle of these adult complications. Meanwhile, within the palace establishment itself, the hospital incident had created its own set of discussions and concerns. Some senior courtiers argued that Charles's restraint during the emergency had been appropriate and demonstrated his commitment to maintaining proper boundaries between personal and public roles. Others, however, quietly expressed concern that the king's approach risked creating unnecessary family trauma while providing little meaningful benefit to the monarchy's public image. Sir Clive Alderton found himself in an increasingly difficult position as the architect of many of the policies that were creating these family tensions. The private secretary had initially believed that clear boundaries would strengthen the monarchy by demonstrating discipline and efficiency. However, the reality of implementing these policies was proving more emotionally complex than anticipated, particularly given Charles's genuine affection for Camilla's family and their years of loyal support. The situation was further complicated by growing media attention to the subtle changes in royal family dynamics. Royal correspondents who had covered the family for decades were noting the decreased visibility of Tom and Laura at various royal events, the absence of their children from traditional family gatherings, and the general shift toward a more formal atmosphere around Charles and Camilla's public appearances. Some media coverage began to speculate about potential rifts within the royal family, though the true nature of the situation remained largely hidden behind the palace's careful management of public information. The speculation, however, added another layer of pressure to an already complex situation, as Charles became increasingly concerned about negative coverage that could damage the monarchy's reputation during the crucial early years of his reign. For Camilla herself, the period following Eliza's accident marked a fundamental shift in her approach to navigating the competing demands of her various roles. The queen consort began to develop a more systematic approach to maintaining her family relationships while respecting the institutional constraints that Charles faced. This involved creating clear separations between her public duties and her private family responsibilities, ensuring that she could be present for important family moments without creating protocol complications for the monarchy. Private family dinners at Clarence House became more frequent and more deliberately planned, providing structured opportunities for family connection that existed outside the formal royal calendar. Camilla also began to develop relationships with other royal family members who could serve as alternative sources of support and connection for her children and grandchildren, particularly Prince William and Catherine, whose own approach to royal family management had evolved in response to their experiences with media scrutiny and public expectation. The ripple effects of the new family dynamics extended beyond immediate relationships to the broader network of friends and associates who had been part of Charles and Camilla's social circle. Annual events that had traditionally brought together various elements of their extended family and friendship networks were quietly restructured or eliminated. Garden parties at Highgrove that had included dozens of family friends and their children were scaled back to focus on more formal charitable and official connections. These changes represented more than just social adjustments. They reflected a fundamental transformation in how Charles understood his role as king in relationship to his personal life. The man who had spent decades arguing for a more accessible, relatable monarchy was now implementing policies that created clear distinctions between public and private, official and personal, in ways that sometimes felt stark and unforgiving even to those implementing them. As winter turned toward spring, the atmosphere around the royal household remained tense and uncertain. Staff members continued to adjust their expectations and procedures to accommodate the new family dynamics, while family members themselves struggled to understand and accept relationships that had been redefined by institutional concerns rather than personal choice. The path forward remained unclear, with all parties trying to balance competing loyalties and responsibilities in a situation that had no clear precedent or easy resolution. Spring arrived at Windsor Castle with an urgency that seemed to mirror the growing crisis within the royal family. The daffodils that Charles had personally planted years earlier bloomed across the grounds, their bright yellow faces turned toward a sun that brought little warmth to the increasingly cold atmosphere surrounding his relationships with Camilla's family. It was during this season of renewal that an unexpected event would force all parties to confront the unsustainable nature of their current situation. The catalyst came in the form of a leaked document that appeared in the Sunday Times in early March. The newspaper published excerpts from what it claimed was an internal palace memo outlining new protocols for extended family interactions and the management of peripheral royal relationships. While the palace immediately denied the authenticity of the specific document, royal correspondents recognized enough accurate details to suggest that someone with inside knowledge had provided the information, whether in the form of an actual memo or detailed briefing notes. The leaked information painted a stark picture of the systematic approach that Charles's advisors had taken toward restructuring his family relationships. The document outlined specific guidelines for determining which family members should be included in various types of royal events, with categories ranging from core family members to associated individuals to former family connections. Camilla's children and grandchildren were listed in the associated individuals category, a designation that placed them alongside distant cousins and childhood friends rather than immediate family members. More damaging still were the financial calculations included in the leaked material. The document detailed the costs associated with security, accommodation, and hospitality for various extended family members, with specific attention paid to what it termed the Bowles/Parker expenditure pattern. The clinical, mathematical approach to relationships that had been sources of joy and support for decades created a public relations disaster that overshadowed any potential benefits of the streamlining policies. The public reaction to the leaked document was swift and largely negative. British newspapers, which had generally supported Charles's early reign and his environmental initiatives, were sharply critical of what they characterized as cold-hearted treatment of family members who had shown loyalty and discretion for decades. Editorial columnists noted the irony of Charles's public advocacy for family values and community connections while systematically excluding people who had been part of his personal family community for generations. Social media amplified the criticism, with particular sympathy expressed for Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopez, who were well-known public figures in their own right. Tom's food writing had made him a familiar and generally well-liked media personality, while Laura's work in the art world had connected her with influential cultural circles. The perception that they were being punished for their association with the royal family rather than rewarded for their years of loyal discretion created a narrative that was difficult for the palace to counter. The crisis deepened when Tom Parker Bowles made an unprecedented decision to address the situation publicly. His statement, released through his literary agent rather than through any royal channels, was carefully worded but unmistakably emotional. He spoke about his love and respect for his stepfather, his understanding of the pressures of royal life, and his commitment to supporting his mother in her role as queen consort. However, he also made clear that the recent changes in family dynamics had been painful for all involved, particularly for the younger generation who had grown up considering themselves part of an extended royal family. The statement's most powerful element was its focus on the children caught in the middle of these adult decisions. Tom described his daughter's confusion about why family traditions had suddenly changed, her questions about whether she had done something to disappoint Grandpa Charles, and the difficult conversations he had been forced to have about the differences between personal relationships and public duties. The human cost of institutional efficiency had rarely been articulated so clearly or so publicly. Charles's response to the public crisis revealed the depth of his personal anguish over the situation he had helped create. Rather than issuing a standard palace statement defending royal protocol, the king chose to address the matter in a private letter to Tom that was later shared with other family members. The letter, while maintaining the formal tone that had characterized their recent interactions, also included acknowledgments of the pain the situation had caused and expressions of his continued affection for Tom's family. However, the letter also made clear that Charles felt trapped by the institutional expectations of his role. He described the constant pressure to demonstrate that the monarchy was relevant, efficient, and responsive to public concerns about cost and privilege. Every decision was being evaluated not just for its immediate impact, but for the precedents it might set and the ammunition it might provide to Republican critics of the monarchy. The private letter's existence became public when excerpts appeared in several newspapers, creating speculation about who had leaked its contents and why. The publication of personal correspondence between Charles and his stepson represented a significant breach of royal privacy, but it also provided the public with insight into the king's genuine feelings about the family crisis he was experiencing. Within the palace itself, the public crisis had created significant divisions among staff and advisors. Some senior courtiers argued that the negative coverage demonstrated exactly why clear boundaries were necessary, that any appearance of favoritism toward Camilla's family would be scrutinized and criticized by media and political opponents. Others, however, began to question whether the policies they had helped implement were creating more problems than they solved. Sir Clive Alderton found himself under particular pressure as the public face of the streamlining policies that had contributed to the family crisis. The private secretary was forced to defend approaches he had helped develop while also managing a public relations disaster that threatened to overshadow the early achievements of Charles's reign. Internal palace discussions about potential policy modifications began to take place, though any changes would need to be implemented carefully to avoid appearing reactive to media pressure. For Camilla, the public nature of the crisis presented challenges that went beyond the family tensions she had been managing privately. As queen consort, she was expected to support her husband's decisions publicly while also maintaining her own relationships with her children and grandchildren. The balance had always been delicate, but the media attention made every gesture and statement subject to analysis for signs of internal conflict. The queen consort's approach to the crisis demonstrated the diplomatic skills she had developed through decades of navigating complex royal relationships. She increased her private time with family members while carefully avoiding any public statements or appearances that could be interpreted as criticism of Charles's policies. Her public schedule during this period focused heavily on her established charitable commitments, particularly those related to literacy and domestic violence prevention, areas where she could demonstrate clear value and purpose in her royal role. Meanwhile, Laura Lopez chose a different approach to managing the public attention. As someone who had always preferred privacy to publicity, she found the media focus on her family situation particularly challenging. Her response was to retreat further from any activities that might be construed as seeking royal association or privilege, effectively demonstrating that she had never sought to capitalize on her mother's position for personal benefit. The broader implications of the crisis extended beyond the immediate family to other peripheral members of the royal network. Friends and associates who had maintained relationships with Charles and Camilla for decades began to reconsider their own positions and expectations. Some chose to distance themselves preemptively rather than risk being categorized as peripheral or associated individuals in future protocol documents. The crisis also highlighted fundamental questions about the nature of modern monarchy and the balance between institutional efficiency and human relationships. Charles had long advocated for a monarchy that was more connected to ordinary people's experiences and challenges. However, the practical implementation of streamlining policies seemed to be moving the institution in the opposite direction, toward greater formality and more rigid boundaries between public and private life. As spring progressed, it became increasingly clear that the current situation was unsustainable for all parties involved. The public criticism was damaging Charles's reputation during crucial early months of his reign, while the family tensions were creating stress for everyone involved, including staff members who had to implement policies they sometimes found personally difficult to support. The need for some kind of resolution became urgent when several major royal events on the summer calendar required decisions about guest lists and family participation. The annual Garter Day ceremony, royal ascot, and various garden parties would normally have included Camilla's family members in some capacity. The question of their involvement had become fraught with political and personal implications that extended far beyond simple social planning. Private discussions began to take place between Charles and Camilla about potential modifications to their approach, though any changes would need to be implemented in ways that preserved both their dignity and the monarchy's institutional credibility. The conversations were difficult and emotional, touching on fundamental questions about the nature of their marriage, their individual obligations, and the price they were willing to pay for institutional efficiency. As the season of renewal continued around them, Charles and Camilla faced the challenge of finding their own path toward healing relationships that had been damaged by good intentions and institutional pressures that had proven more powerful than anyone had anticipated. The resolution to the crisis that had torn through the heart of the royal family began in the most unlikely of places. A chance encounter in the gardens of Highgrove House on a warm May afternoon. Charles had retreated to his beloved estate for one of his regular periods of reflection, seeking solace among the organic gardens and sustainable farming projects that had always provided him with clarity during difficult periods. What he didn't expect was to find 8-year-old Eliza Lopez crouched beside his prize herb garden, carefully examining a butterfly that had landed on a sprig of lavender. The child had come to Highgrove with her mother Laura for what was meant to be a brief, practical visit to collect some personal items that had been left there during happier times. Laura had hoped to avoid any encounters that might prove awkward or painful, planning the visit for a time when Charles was supposed to be in London for official duties. However, a cancelled meeting had brought the king back to Gloucestershire earlier than expected, creating the first unguarded moment between him and a member of Camilla's family in many months. Eliza's presence in his garden, her obvious fascination with the natural world that had always been his passion, and her complete lack of awareness of the complicated adult tensions surrounding her created a moment of clarity for Charles. Watching her gentle interaction with the butterfly, he was reminded of countless similar moments over the years, teaching Tom about sustainable farming practices, helping Laura's children identify different plant species, sharing his environmental knowledge with a new generation that would inherit the world he was working to protect. The conversation that followed was brief, but transformative. Eliza, with the directness that only children possess, asked why she hadn't seen her grandpa Charles lately and whether he was still interested in teaching her about gardens. Her questions were without accusation or manipulation, simply the honest curiosity of a child who had noticed an important relationship in her life had changed without explanation. Charles's response came from a place deeper than protocol or institutional duty. He knelt beside the child in the garden soil, pointing out different insects and plants while explaining their relationships within the ecosystem. For 20 minutes, the complexities of royal life faded away as he rediscovered the simple pleasure of sharing knowledge with an eager young mind. When Laura finally found them, she discovered her daughter and stepfather engaged in the kind of natural, educational conversation that had always characterized their relationship. The encounter forced Charles to confront the fundamental contradiction in his recent behavior. He had spent years advocating for environmental protection and sustainability based on his belief in intergenerational responsibility, the idea that current actions should be evaluated based on their impact on future generations. Yet his institutional policies had been severing relationships with the very children who represented that future, cutting them off from educational opportunities and emotional connections that had been benefiting both them and him. That evening, Charles made a decision that would require him to challenge his own advisors and reconsider the direction his reign had taken. He called a private meeting with Sir Clive Alderton and other senior courtiers to discuss what he termed a fundamental reassessment of our family relationship protocols. The meeting, held in his private study at Highgrove, was unlike any of their previous discussions about streamlining and efficiency. Charles began by acknowledging that the policies they had implemented had achieved some of their intended goals. The monarchy did appear more disciplined and focused in its public presentation, and there had been fewer opportunities for critics to point to apparent examples of royal privilege being extended to peripheral individuals. However, he argued, these benefits had come at a cost that he was no longer willing to pay. The king's presentation to his advisors was both personal and philosophical. He spoke about his lifelong commitment to environmental causes and his belief that these commitments required him to think beyond immediate institutional benefits to longer-term impacts. The relationships he had been severing with Camilla's family, he argued, were not just personal connections but educational and cultural bridges between the monarchy and the next generation. These children would grow up to be influential adults in their own right, and their childhood experiences with royal life would shape their future attitudes toward the institution. More significantly, Charles argued that his treatment of Camilla's family was inconsistent with the values he wanted his monarchy to represent. He had always advocated for the importance of family relationships, community connections, and intergenerational responsibility. The systematic exclusion of people who had been loyal and supportive for decades sent a message about royal values that contradicted everything he hoped to achieve as king. The advisor's response revealed the depth of institutional thinking that had driven the original policies. They presented detailed analyses of public opinion polling, media coverage assessments, and financial projections that supported their recommendations for clear boundaries and limited family access. However, Charles's counterargument focused on different metrics: the long-term health of the monarchy as an institution, the importance of authentic relationships in maintaining public support, and the personal sustainability of policies that created ongoing family conflict. The turning point in the discussion came when Charles presented his own analysis of the public reaction to the recent family crisis. Contrary to the advisor's assumptions, the negative media coverage had not focused primarily on royal privilege or excessive spending. Instead, the criticism had concentrated on the coldness and apparent callousness of excluding loyal family members, particularly children, from traditional relationships and activities. The public, it seemed, was more concerned about royal humanity than royal efficiency. Following this pivotal meeting, Charles initiated a series of private conversations with Camilla about how they might modify their approach without completely abandoning the legitimate institutional concerns that had motivated the original policies. These discussions were among the most important of their marriage, requiring both partners to articulate their fundamental values and priorities while also acknowledging the practical constraints of royal life. Camilla's response to Charles's willingness to reconsider their approach was both relieved and cautious. She had spent months trying to maintain family relationships while respecting the institutional boundaries he had established, a balancing act that had proved emotionally exhausting and ultimately unsustainable. However, she also understood that any changes would need to be implemented carefully to avoid undermining Charles's authority or appearing to bow to media pressure. The solution they developed together represented a more nuanced approach to royal family management than either the complete inclusion that had characterized their earlier years or the systematic exclusion that had defined recent months. They established what they privately termed natural boundaries, guidelines that would allow family relationships to develop organically while maintaining appropriate distinctions between public and private activities. Under this new approach, Camilla's family members would be welcome at private family gatherings and traditional celebrations like Christmas and Easter, but their participation in official state functions would be limited and carefully considered based on specific circumstances. Children would be encouraged to maintain their relationships with Charles and to learn from his expertise in areas like environmental conservation, but these interactions would take place primarily in private settings rather than public venues. The first test of this modified approach came with the summer planning for Royal Ascot and the annual garden parties at Buckingham Palace. Rather than complete exclusion or automatic inclusion, decisions about family participation were made based on the specific nature of each event and the potential benefits for both the family members and the monarchy. Tom Parker Bowles was invited to join the Royal Ascot party in recognition of his long-standing interest in horse racing and his ability to contribute positively to the social atmosphere. Laura's children were included in a private family lunch during the racing week, allowing them to experience an important royal tradition while maintaining appropriate boundaries around their public visibility. The implementation of these changes required careful communication with media outlets to ensure that the modifications were understood as thoughtful evolution rather than capitulation to criticism. Palace briefings emphasized Charles's commitment to both family values and institutional responsibility, presenting the changes as evidence of mature leadership rather than policy reversal. The response from Camilla's family to these developments was positive, but necessarily cautious. Tom and Laura had both been hurt by the months of exclusion and uncertainty, and they needed time to rebuild trust and comfort with their roles in the royal family structure. However, the return to more natural interactions, particularly Charles's renewed relationship with the grandchildren, provided a foundation for healing that benefited everyone involved. For Eliza and her cousins, the changes meant a return to educational opportunities and relationship experiences that had always been important parts of their lives. Charles resumed his role as environmental educator and grandfather figure, sharing his knowledge and passion with a new generation while also learning from their perspectives and questions. These interactions, conducted primarily in private settings like Highgrove and Clarence House, provided mutual benefits without creating public relations complications. The broader implications of Charles's policy modifications extended beyond immediate family relationships to the monarchy's approach to modernization and efficiency. The experience had demonstrated that institutional streamlining needed to account for human relationships and emotional sustainability, not just financial efficiency and protocol simplification. The most effective royal policies, Charles learned, were those that enhanced rather than undermined the authentic relationships that gave the monarchy its emotional relevance and public support. As autumn returned to the royal estates, the atmosphere around Charles and Camilla's family life had settled into a new equilibrium that balanced institutional requirements with personal relationships. The crisis had tested their marriage, challenged their understanding of royal duty, and forced them to articulate their fundamental values in ways they had never needed to do before. The resolution, while imperfect, had demonstrated that even ancient institutions could adapt and evolve when human needs were given appropriate weight alongside administrative efficiency. The garden at Highgrove, where the first step toward reconciliation had taken place, continued to bloom and change with the seasons, providing a natural metaphor for the royal family's own growth and adaptation. Charles's renewed relationships with Camilla's children and grandchildren brought back the warmth and authenticity that had always been among his greatest strengths as both a person and a king, while the modified protocols ensured that these relationships could flourish within appropriate institutional boundaries. The cold silence that had once stunned the palace had given way to a more mature understanding of how personal relationships and public duties could coexist, creating a foundation for family harmony that would prove more sustainable than either complete inclusion or systematic exclusion could ever have been.